I think that without sports, the civil rights movement couldn't have happened. I think sports made Americans more comfortable to accept what later became social and legal and political progress. Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in baseball led to later where we could have a social movement 10 years later where Rosa Parks could sit on a bus, and then 10 years after that voting. Because as people began to be more comfortable in each other's presence, whether it was at a ballpark or a basketball court, people could then begin to see the fallacy of a superior race or an inferior race. As long as something is away from you, as long as something is something you don't have to touch and interact, you can make it anything you want. Inferior, superior, doesn't matter. But when you sit next to a guy and his kid is eating popcorn like yours and they are not innately different, it becomes, even without effort, more difficult for you to demonize them and make them pariahs. And I think that sports brought people together, even if they backed them into each other, more than the history gives it credit for, which made people more conducive when the civil rights movement started.
When you talked about Jackie Robinson, and I knew Jackie very well, had a lot of admiration for him, but I always talked about the man that truly integrated baseball was not Jackie, it was Branch Rickey. Jackie called him Mr. Rickey. And he stepped out from the power structure and he decided that baseball should be integrated. One reason might be because it's the right thing to do. The other reason might be because box office, there was a whole black audience out there that went to baseball games. And he could have chosen Satchel Paige or Josh Gibson because they were great, great baseball players. But he chose Jackie because he knew Jackie had the ability to play great baseball, yet play the political role that he had to play, even though it was killing him.
And I grew up in the 60s as a child at Proviso East, which was on 60 Minutes in the 60s because of race riots. And my dad was a police through that, and I got to sit on the curb and watch state police line down Maywood. And the blacks walked on one side and the whites walked on the other side, and they were throwing stuff back and forth. And I used to just sit there and watch them do it and think, well, what are they mad at? I remember asking my dad that, like, what are they mad at? And he used to say, they don't know. They just don't know. And so I think that helps me, yeah. But I think sports helps me too. I think sports, you don't care what's next to you. You just want to know, can he play? And I think that does help. I think people who play sports learn that early on, that there's no race, there's people. And I think that's important.
The impact of black athletes during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s is far-reaching. It impacted not just how whites viewed African Americans, but also how African Americans themselves viewed their athletic role models. Prime examples, probably Jackie Robinson, Jim Brown are two that stick out. Another that shouldn't be forgotten is Bill Russell, and Ernie Davis is another athlete when Disney has even made a movie, The Express, about his impact, not just on the football field, but also in the civil rights movement in general. I think it's safe to say that any successful African American athlete was a role model to an African American during the civil rights movement. I think that influence expanded beyond just the African American population to also incorporate and maybe even soften views of whites that might not have been not racist, probably is the best way to put it. So in one dynamic you might have someone who perhaps might be viewed as racist that would cheer an African American on either the baseball diamond, the basketball court, or the football field, but would not necessarily be comfortable sitting down at a supper table with another African American. So there's that dichotomy. Additionally, these players, I think one reason why they were successful was each of them were the best in their field. Bill Russell was the best center. Jim Brown was the best running back. Jackie Robinson's in the Baseball Hall of Fame. And so that's why we still talk about them today. Had they not been able to be successful in their respective fields, I think that might have actually been a blowback, not just to integration in all the sports, but perhaps even how the positive impact of African American athletes had on lower income or impoverished African Americans at that time.
I feel that the impact of African American professional athletes in the 60s during the civil rights movement had a tremendous impact on the lower level income level African Americans in America, because it gave them a sense of hope. It gave them a sense of belonging. It also gave them a sense of pride to identify themselves with a champion. In other words, when the African American athlete would win, especially people like Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier, and in the world of baseball, Hank Aaron, you felt like you hit a home run. You felt like you got the knockout. And so I thought it had an extreme impact on low-level income African Americans during the civil rights movement. So, yeah.
It relates to how African Americans have been, African American young men, and women too, have been helped through athletics and looking up to people who've succeeded in the athletic world. And I think that was one of the first areas, really, because they could look at people like Jackie Robinson and like Satchel Paige and like Wilt Chamberlain, and great athletes in basketball, baseball, and football too, like Jim Brown. And sometimes they expect, just like any kid wants to be a star athlete, and this is a way to succeed. Very few people actually make that. So there's a danger in that. But at the same time, I think it gives people something to shoot for. And I think in that respect, they could say, okay, I can be on baseball teams and everything now, and the team effort comes through because I see other African Americans who've made it in big time in sports. And even though they may not make it to the top in the sport, they might do something that's related in that area, plus the skills and the people skills and the discipline that they learn in sports, I think, can help them later on in life.
I believe that sports did play a very large role for African Americans in the civil rights movement, mainly because sports athletes were looked at as very, very large figures. Jackie Robinson, there were several Olympic athletes who were looked at as more as Americans and not just African Americans, which helped. It helped that the African Americans in sports were looked at as role models, so that helped African Americans in society in general, help them to be looked at as more than they were in the past, as actual people.
I think it affected me with white people because, like, I think since I played sports, it helped me get along with many white people. And, like, it gets you closer, you get about closer to white people and stuff like that.
Back in the day, African Americans being able to play in sports during the civil rights movement actually had a huge impact on them, because it showed that not just white people were good at sports, but black people were too, and they were finally able to fit in.
I look up as them as important role models and look up to them. I figured without them, I wouldn't be as good as I am today. They are the ones that really inspired me and set the way for us.
It inspired me to become something like just because of what Black African Americans went through. Seeing what Jackie Robinson went through made me appreciate being able to play basketball with white people. I think that sports had a big influence on African Americans. There's a positive influence actually because like some African Americans probably would have been killed or something during racism back in the day. So sports influenced them big time because it like kept them like involved and stuff, kept them out of trouble. And I think that's like the same with me today. Sports keep me involved, keep me out of trouble, doing a whole lot of bad things that I shouldn't do, and I don't do it because of basketball. So